6 years and 1 day after Hitler invaded Poland, Japan signed the Instrument of Surrender. September 2nd, 1945. No one will ever know how many died. No one will ever know the name of the first or the last victim. But they are the story of the Second World War. Not the tanks that could not move, or the planes that could not fly, or the ships that could not sail without them. War is about people, in uniform or not. People in cities, villages, jungles. Strangers as allies. Neighbors as enemies. Hundreds of millions of people for whom for 6 years and 1 day there was hell on earth. There was no peace after the war. After the bloodshed of 1914 to 1918, after the peacemakers had all gone home, fighting did not stop. Civil war in Russia, then in China, then in Spain, invasion in Ethiopia, in Austria, in Czechoslovakia, the Chaco War, street battles in Germany, in America, the pain of going hungry, of having no work, the rise and rise of dictators. Then, one more invasion. But this time, the whole thing fell apart. September 1st, 1939. The first argument about the war, which goes by different names in different places, is when did it start?
Second World War began in Asia, at a bridge called Lugotiao, known in the West as the Marco Polo Bridge.
Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the Chinese nationalist government, said that he would seek a peaceful settlement. But he added,
"Perhaps now is the time to make public the declaration to demonstrate our determination to fight."
He ordered a general state of alert. He ordered his troops to prepare for resistance.
He did represent the nation more than anybody else, I think. Of course, quite largely thanks to his wife, Mei Ling. She portrayed her husband as very much, the guardian of China, the man who is standing up to the Japanese oppressor.
The Japanese used the Marco Polo Bridge incident as an excuse for launching a full-scale invasion. And the Second World War had begun.
The war between Japan and China, anticipated for some time, passed from the period of small local actions to more concentrated warfare.
Beijing fell apart after 2 days, and Tianjin 2 days after that. When the help he expected from Britain or America failed to materialize, Chiang Kai-shek, as commander-in-chief, said,
"Since all hope for peace has been lost, all we can do now is resist to the bitter end."
A Chinese officer recorded in his diary.
Intense Japanese artillery fire, as if it would level the mountains and wipe out the sea.
Nanjing fell to the invader on December the 13th. And the cruel violence that would claim more civilian than combatant victims in the Second World War began to count its dead.
Battle, massacre, pestilence, and starvation have claimed more than 5 million Chinese lives. And millions more, their homes and villages destroyed, are today hungry, frightened refugees.
The exact death toll of the Nanjing violence can never be known. Not less than 50,000. Perhaps 6 times that number. The dead were thrown into pits. The living were buried alive. The tortured and murdered were hurled into the river. Japan's head of military security in Shanghai expressed the racist attitude that made violence possible. He said,
"We can do anything to such creatures."
A Japanese soldier wrote in his diary,
I trod on the corpses of Chinese soldiers without care, for my heart had become wild.
Mutilated bodies were burned. Women were raped and disfigured.
A long time ago, we thought that events like the rape of Nanjing were out-of-control madness. But now, as with most other mass atrocities against civilians, it's becoming increasingly clear that they were much more controlled than that characterization would suggest.
This nightmare of cruelty was all the more horrible because it was deliberately planned by the Japanese High Command to tear the heart out of the Chinese people once and forever.
A Japanese officer wrote,
In times of peace, these acts would be totally unthinkable and inhuman. But in the strange environment of the battlefield, they are easy.
He would be proven right on every battlefield, on every continent. Europe turned away from China's tragedy, distracted by the Anschluss. Adolf Hitler, appointed German Chancellor in 1933 and named Führer in 1934, had marched into the demilitarized Rhineland without a shot being fired. In the Anschluss, he sent his troops into and annexed Austria. He then began to demand the ethnic German part of Czechoslovakia, known as the Sudetenland. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain led an attempt at conciliation, known as appeasement.
Neville Chamberlain has had a very bad press. He's been blamed for the failure of appeasement. My own sense is that what he was doing was an honorable and justifiable thing.
He's been completely influenced in his thinking by the letters he's received. Who are these letters from? And these are postbags and postbags full of letters. And these letters are mainly from women, mothers and wives.
Out of this little danger, we pluck this flower safety.
He was not the naive, wide-eyed idiot that some people portray him as. He didn't trust Hitler. He was trying to get the best deal.
Appeasement reached its climax with the deal made at Munich.
Finally, the most popular arrival of all. To a world balancing on the brink of chaos, Mr. Chamberlain stands as the savior of peace.
Munich is about buying time to a large extent. It's about not being ready to fight. And it's about exploring options, although they're ever-decreasing options.
We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire never to go to war with one another again.
The Sudetenland was surrendered to Germany in exchange for the promise of no more territorial ambition.
But of course, Hitler rips up the treaty within months.
The future became the present on March 14, 1939. Adolf Hitler threatened Prague with complete destruction by the Luftwaffe unless the nation surrendered itself unconditionally to Germany's protection.
He sends in the tanks into taking over the rest of Czechoslovakia in early 1939.
The hoped-for continued world peace had placed the free world into the untenable position of compromising with a power-mad dictator.
That's where you know that this man's shopping list just continues and you're on it.
The sacrifice of Czechoslovakia was to prove, given an inch, Hitler would now reach for a mile.
Next on the shopping list was Poland. Franz Halder, Chief of Staff of the Army High Command, explained the plan.
The intention of the Führer and Goering? To destroy and exterminate the Polish people.
Propaganda ruthlessly shaped German opinion.
It is a narrative that there are acts of aggression by the Polish army against Germany's territorial integrity. Germany is provoked by Poland. Poland is rearming. Poland has got the guarantee of the British and the French. And Poland is mistreating the German minority.
At 4:45 a.m. on the 1st of September 1939, the German cruiser Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish fort of Westerplatte. At that moment, without warning or declaration, German soldiers with air and naval support invaded Poland from 3 sides.
Communications blown up as the defenders impede the invasion every way they can.
Moishe Fishman, a young man who would survive Auschwitz, remembered,
Suddenly German bombers appeared. There was no war declared. They asked for volunteers. We had to be the fire brigade. We were not equipped to deal with the incendiary bombs. All we had were buckets of water.
Place after place is captured as the mechanized columns speed on. From the north, they're driving toward Warsaw.
1.5 million German soldiers in 67 divisions invaded. Aircraft were opposed by a Polish air force of 400 machines.
This was the day Germany had been building for and waiting for. And with larceny in their hearts, they gloried in the destruction they were letting loose upon the world.
Hans Lehmann was one of the soldiers.
When we marched into Poland, there were corpses all around. They lay around and no one bothered about them.
I have to tell you now, this country is at war with Germany.
The reaction of the Allies to the invasion of Poland was to declare war on Germany, but the actual practical effect of what they would do next was problematic because, of course, there was no easy way they could get troops and material in to assist Poland.
Hermann Goering, Supreme Commander of the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, was disturbed by Britain's declaration of war.
If we lose this war, God help us.
By September 6th, Warsaw's air defense was limited to 96 anti-aircraft guns.
Warsaw is the first big city that is being bombarded from the air, so they are suffering, and the city is getting, well, to 20% or so. It's getting destroyed, and you have dead lying on the street.
Stefan Stashinsky, the Lord Mayor of Warsaw, reported,
"In the early hours of the morning, 7 of our hospitals were bombed.
Wounded civilian victims of earlier air raids in the city had occupied these beds when this raid came. It was like a grim avenger, relentlessly determined that they should not escape, that they should find no peace."
Jadwiga Sosonowska was a nurse.
A girl of 16, both legs a mass of bleeding pulp. I bent over to kiss her brow. She died quietly.
On the 13th, dive bombers caused widespread fires. Finally, on the 25th, Warsaw endured the largest air raid the world had seen to that point.
There was a very strong belief that targeting large urban areas was the way that you would win a war on this scale. And to some degree, really, the war itself was only about that policy gradually coming to fruition.
Adam Goldberg was an eyewitness.
The German Stukas flew overhead and machine-gunned. People and retreating soldiers also. There were many dead.
Many of the middle-aged were sullen and angry. Youngsters were half resentful, half resigned, while their elders turned to prayer. These are the faces of a nation besieged.
When the fighting war began, so did the war against civilians. The German policy was called Schrecklichkeit, frightfulness. Hitler said,
"My death's head formations, to kill without pity or mercy all men, women and children of Polish descent or language."
On the day that Britain and France declared war, 55 peasants were rounded up and shot at the village of Truskolaci.
There had been murders, there had been people who were killed, people were displaced, but never on the scale of the Third Reich. And so who would have thought? Who would have thought that this was going to happen?
As German forces advanced into Poland, 120,000 Japanese in 6 divisions advanced on the Chinese city of Changsha.
There are people who say Japan's mission is to expand in Asia, not least because of this assumption that a weak China and a weak Korea, in the face of the onslaught of Western imperialism, make Japan itself vulnerable.
Kurisayashi was barely into his teens when he volunteered to fight.
We listened to stories about others who had died for our country. Basically, education was all about teaching us to die for our country.
Changsha, defended by outgunned forces, turned back the assault under the leadership of a Cantonese general, Shui Yoi, who wrote,
"We have destroyed China, removed every stone, burned down every farm, torn up every railway track. And we have done this so successfully that the Japanese have repented of their invasion."
But because of the imperialist threat, and also because of the Japanese invasion, which was also imperialist threat, right, to make Chinese to realize, oh, now we need to fight together against the enemy from the outside.
That which is stronger than stone walls had at last been born in China. The will to resist. The people who wouldn't surrender. The people determined to fight for their freedom, their good earth. The people who can't be beaten.
Japanese policy was committed to expansion for territory and resources. One faction favored going north, another striking south. The balance was tilted by a battle between Japanese and Soviet troops on the Mongolian border.
In remote Mongolia, Japan and Soviet Russia are fighting, with planes shot down and sky fighters swooping back like this to land at their base.
The Japanese defeated in Mongolia consolidates this idea that to save ourselves we need to go south rather than going north.
The Soviet-Japanese peace agreement, following the Battle of Khalkhin-Gol, guaranteed Stalin's Asian frontiers against Japanese aggression. Thus reassured, and as secretly agreed with Hitler, Stalin sent the Red Army into Poland.
The annihilation of Poland would mean one fewer bourgeois fascist state to contend with.
It was really a very big surprise for the Polish army, because they have no idea for what Soviet army came on this territory. Will they help to the Polish army to fight against Nazis, or will they just take this territory of Western Belarus?
Subjected to almost continuous bombardment by the Luftwaffe, the Polish capital, with its 1 million inhabitants, fought on against overwhelming strength for 3 weeks. Completely cut off, with supplies of food and water almost finished, with totally inadequate defensive equipment, a helpless target for Hitler's bombs and shells, Warsaw fought on till the 27th of September.
Warsaw surrendered. A German soldier observed.
Polish heavy guns are being carted off by our soldiers. Lorries are already moving to the woods to take the prisoners away.
On September 28th, Radio Warsaw played Chopin's Funeral March, and on the 29th, the Nazis and the Soviets divided the country. 65,000 Polish troops were killed in the fighting. 420,000 others became prisoners of the Germans. 240,000 prisoners of the Soviets. Zygmunt Klukowski was one of those affected.
The Germans posted several new regulations. All men of Jewish religion between the ages of 15 and 60 must report at City Hall with brooms, shovels, and buckets. They will be cleaning city streets.
As a result of the invasion, the number of Jews living under Nazi rule jumped from 300,000 to 3 million. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer of the SS and one of the most powerful men in the Nazi regime, was clear about what was intended.
The time has come to drive this rabble into ghettos, and then epidemics will erupt, and they'll all croak.
A new subject introduced to the curriculum was racial science. So obviously this was very much connected to Nazi racial ideology. It meant that history was conceived of in racial terms.
The first genocidal massacres took place. 6,500 on the parade ground at Grupa. More than 10,000 in the gravel pits at Mniszuk. The tone had been set.
All of the other things that follow can only really be understood once you appreciate the identity that was being crafted and people were embracing and internalizing of what it meant to be German.
The writer George Orwell spoke for many.
Millions of others like me have got a feeling that the world's gone wrong.
Britain dropped 12 million leaflets in retaliation for the invasion of Poland. They called it the Confetti War. Hitler's Minister for Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, noted in his diary,
"The Führer is of the opinion that England must be given a KO blow. Quite right, too."
On October 9th, Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 6, calling for an offensive in the West, calling for an attack across the First World War battlefields of Belgium and northern France. The generals convinced their Führer to delay the offensive until the spring. That delay was called initially by an American senator the phony war. But for countless people, the war and the violence were far from phony.
No capital city has suffered more terribly than Warsaw. Since the day of surrender, a blackout of total misery has enveloped the city, apart from flashes of news of appalling atrocities to illuminate its plight.
Killing squads accounted for 45% of Poland's doctors, 57% of her lawyers, 40% of professors, virtually all journalists, and more than 2,600 priests.
Most of Nazi racial theory really was pseudoscience. There is effectively no real biological basis for much of what they say.
Joseph Goebbels noted in his diary,
"The Führer's verdict on the Poles is devastating."
Hitler said,
"The standard of living in the country is to remain low. It is of use to us only as a reservoir of labor."
Actually, the Soviet occupation is even more violent than the German occupation. More Poles die in those first 1.5 years through the Soviets than die through German hands.
The Soviet Union shipped 291,513 Polish citizens to the Gulag, and in April 1940, took 21,892 Poles to the Katyn Forest and other sites, where they were shot by Soviet killers.
My father was caught by Russians, and he said, "We are going to be taken to the United States." But that was a lie. They were all taken to Katyn and shot.
On October 4th, Hitler took the salute of his triumphant forces in the Polish capital. In Britain, they waited. In France, they put their faith in the Maginot Line, complex and formidable fortifications that guarded the Franco-German border.
The French armies, march a few miles into German territory along the Rhine, but then they come back again.
In November, Joseph Stalin, confident after success in Poland, sent the Red Army into Finland, a land grab that hoped to restore territory once ruled by the Tsars.
Red planes over the Finnish capital. The terrors of total war loosed upon the unoffending population of Helsinki.
The weather was Arctic. There was a meter of snow across the ground. The Russians, you'd think, would be used to those conditions, in fact weren't. They were colossally underprepared, and the Finns exploited this.
The Winter War was a major embarrassment, and Marshal Voroshilov told Stalin why the Red Army was having difficulty securing victory.
"You have yourself to blame for all this. You had our best generals killed."
The Red Army stumbled, led the Nazis to make a dangerous assessment. Goebbels said,
"The Russians are making absolutely no progress in Finland. The Red Army really does seem to be of little military worth."
You can imagine how small Finland and how big Third Reich. That's why Hitler understood that he's ready and we can go against Soviets and destroy them.
Lebensraum for Hitler meant seizing land in the east, but first he would ensure against a war on two fronts. His plans for 1940 were clear enough. He told Goebbels,
"I want to beat England, whatever it costs."
So there's really two objectives from the German, the Nazi point of view. Clearly they want to knock France out of the war, but for Hitler and for the Germans, the real war is always going to be in the east.
Rationing had begun in Japan and Germany before the war. At the start of 1940, it was introduced into Britain.
It's not well thought through and carefully planned. It's just the rations are designed according to what they've got to give people.
Eyewitnesses, who were children at the time, remember,
"We had 3 colour ration books, a buff colour for adults, a blue one for teenagers, and a green one for infants."
And each page had little squares with letters on them.
You took your ration card to the shop, and he had a pencil, and they'd cross off the square, which meant you'd had it that week.
The subject of this great wartime experiment in food are not white mice or guinea pigs, but human beings fighting for their lives.
the troubles faced by countless others, the targets of German racial policy, were of a different dimension. Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary,
Himmler is presently shifting populations, not always successfully.
Himmler was shifting populations onto trains and into camps and ghettos. By early 1940, a mobile gas chamber was in use in Poland. But the fighting war seemed to have stalled. The view of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was,
whatever reason Hitler has had for making no endeavor to overwhelm us, one thing is certain. He has missed the bus.
That was April 4th. Operation Weserübung, the assault on Denmark and Norway, launched at dawn on April 9th.
Ships, transports, tanks, men, planes, all flung themselves simultaneously upon a defenseless country.
By the end of the first day, the Germans had achieved every objective.
By the afternoon of April 9th, the Germans were in complete control of all 7 ports where they had landed in the morning.
Allied action to confront the Germans in Norway was a disastrous catalogue of fumbling, bungling, and bickering. The expeditionary force sent to Trondheim outnumbered the Germans 6-1 and was routed. The Royal Navy had to evacuate 11,300 troops. 4,396 were lost. The invasion of Norway cost Germany almost half of its destroyer force, meaning a cross-channel invasion would be impossible without air superiority. The British benefited by taking possession of the Norwegian merchant marine. Il Duce, Benito Mussolini, the first dictator, having taken control of Italy in 1922, saw the scale of Germany's success and, tragically for his people, felt left out.
His decision to enter the Second World War
was very ruinous for Italy.
It is humiliating to remain with our hands folded while others write history. To make a people great, it is necessary to send them to battle, even if you have to kick them in the pants.
But the greatest impact of the disaster in Norway was felt in the British House of Commons. Neville Chamberlain, having lost the support of his party, stood down. The candidates his party favoured to replace him were not supported by the opposition, and a compromise candidate was appointed to head a national government. It was Winston Churchill.
Churchill's been portrayed as a sort of wine-bibbing Liberal Democrat. In fact, he was a whiskey-sloshing Tory thug, and that's just what we needed where Hitler was concerned.
Behind Mr. Churchill, the country rallies solidly and resolutely to the task of defeating the most sinister madman that ever aspired to world conquest.
Winston Churchill was 65 years old, and this was his time. And the timing was uncanny.
The year is 1940. The German soldier stands before all mankind, confident of his own power to destroy and conquer. Where next will Hitler's legion strike? The answer comes quickly enough. 150 Nazi divisions receive the call to hurl their might on Western Europe.
May 10th, the day of Churchill's appointment, was the day Hitler unleashed his invasion of Belgium and France. History calls the Blitzkrieg.
Germany's air arm blazes the trail for the opening attacks on Holland, Belgium, and tiny, undefended Luxembourg, ready to rain untold horror upon all that spread out below their wings.
Blitzkrieg, of course, is a fantasy to a certain degree. It was a word which even Hitler despised.
Blitzkrieg is a really interesting tactic because it doesn't just work tactically. It doesn't just work on the ground. It works psychologically.
The Nazi machine broke the back of Dutch resistance in 4 days. Towns and villages were in flames as the invaders rolled on at a breathless pace, encircling the defenders and slashing their armies, destroying in the name of the new order the homes and shops of those who had dared to resist.
Joseph Goebbels recorded the campaign's ultimate objective.
The Fuhrer has set his mind on a great war against England. England must be chased out of Europe, and France destroyed as a great power. Then Germany will have hegemony, and Europe will have peace.
As the offensive stormed forward, Mussolini declared war on France and Britain. His army was smaller and less well equipped than it had been in the First World War. Count Ciano, his foreign minister, who was also his son-in-law, wrote in his diary,
I am sad, very sad. May God help Italy.
2 days after Churchill took office on May 12th, the leading German units crossed into France, securing the north bank of the Meuse. Staff Sergeant Rubath was with the leading unit.
With my section, I reached the bank of the Meuse in a rush. Enemy machine guns fire from the right flank. During the crossing, constant firing from our machine guns batters the enemy, and thus not one casualty occurs.
And of course, at that point, the Maginot Line fails to operate because the Germans decide to attack through the Low Countries, and they also extend through the Ardennes, where the Maginot Line did not extend to.
The same day, the Dutch army was ordered to fall back for a last stand on the line Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Utrecht. Joe de Haan was a young Dutch Jew who would spend the entire war in hiding.
In the Netherlands, occupation forces behaved themselves impeccably. But of course, the lull didn't last all that long.
On the day that the Netherlands surrendered, French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud remarked,
"We have been defeated. We are beaten. We have lost the battle. The front is broken. They are pouring through in great numbers."
On the 17th, the fighting at Sedan ended.
One of the places they went through was a place called Sedan, which the French should have known about because that's where they were defeated in 1817. Nevertheless, the German armies sweep through the Ardennes.
It would have been entirely possible once the Germans break through the Meuse River around Sedan and through the Ardennes forest. The bridgehead that they make is relatively small and relatively weakly defended. If the French had counterattacked relatively quickly, they probably would have destroyed it. But they don't.
A British Army officer kept a diary.
It appears that as the Sedan sector was considered so strong, the most inferior of the French divisions were posted there. When the dive bombers came down, they stood the noise for 2 hours and then bolted out like a lot of frightened old ladies.
A French staff officer admitted,
The infantry cowered in their trenches. Their only concern was to keep their heads well down.
In 7 days, the Germans had advanced 320 kilometers, crossed the Meuse, and broken into the undefended Allied rear.
There was also no proper plan to deal with the armoured breakthrough that happened in the Ardennes.
Jock Watt was with the British Army, with the Royal Tank Regiment.
The road from Boulogne was just full of moving bodies. That's all I could call them because they didn't look like people. There were men, women and children with bags, dragging little trucks. The children weren't talking or playing. All with vacant expressions, just looking straight ahead, going nowhere.
"8 million French abandoned their homes in a month.
A flaming wave of wholesale death and destruction sweeps southward through France ahead of the raging battlefront, striking down all in its path.
Eyewitnesses saw scenes of horror and despair.
The whole country seems suddenly to have given itself up. Everything has collapsed, imploded.
The 7th Panzer Division under General Erwin Rommel reached Cambrai on May 21st. On May 24th, German Army Group Van Kleist, comprising 3 panzer divisions, stopped less than 25 kilometers from Dunkirk. In one of the war's regular and endlessly debated turning points, the German offensive was ordered to halt.
One of the fatal decisions made by Hitler and his commanders during the Second World War was to stop the Panzer's advance on Dunkirk.
The Germans have been fighting for 3 weeks. Their forces are exhausted. So the German generals, and not as many people think, Hitler, ordered them to stop on the perimeter of the Dunkirk beaches.
The tank forces in particular were absolutely exhausted from an incredibly rapid advance across France, and they just couldn't go any farther.
Von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group A, gave the order. Hitler supported the order, and Hermann Goering rejoiced. The kill would be left to his Luftwaffe, which, he confidently said, could finish off the armies trapped at Dunkirk. It could not.
The smoke from the fires of Dunkirk almost obscured the sun. But in this inferno, while the BEF and their French comrades held off the Nazis in an epic rearguard action, it was here that the yachts, motorboats and Saucy Janes performed magnificent feats of rescue.
On May 26th, the evacuation of Allied troops from Dunkirk began.
The evacuation of Dunkirk means several things. I mean, in sheer practical terms, it means that the British have literally hundreds of thousands of men to continue the fight.
There were 222 Royal Navy and approximately 860 civilian vessels at Dunkirk. The small craft ferrying the troops to the Navy vessels waiting offshore.
The soldiers were coming off the beach, clinging to bits of wood and wreckage and anything that would float.
A number of Royal Navy ships were lost, 6 destroyers were sunk, but the British very much felt that that was a price worth paying.
Instead of the 45,000 hoped for, the fleet took off 338,000 Allied troops.
The story of that epic withdrawal will live in history, both as a glorious example of discipline and as a monument to sea power.
But the army had been effectively disarmed, leaving 64,000 vehicles, 76,000 tons of ammunition, and 2,500 guns behind. On June 11th, Paris was declared an open city, and on the 14th, General Boguslav von Studnitz led the 87th Infantry Division through the heart of the city. On the 15th, 400,000 Frenchmen of the surrounded 3rd, 5th, and 8th armies surrendered. The French surrender was signed on June 22nd. On June 24th, Hitler took a 3-hour sightseeing tour of Paris. Asked about a victory parade, he said,
"I am not in the mood for a victory parade. We aren't at the end yet."
The fall of France subtracted a major industrial economy from the Allied cause and put French ports in German hands, halving the distance U-boats had to travel to reach the Atlantic shipping lanes.
France has fallen, no allies. Britain is standing alone.
The mood in England was grim. Arthur Crutchley and Peter Matthews were young men destined to serve in the armed forces.
After Dunkirk, they called for volunteers because they thought naturally we'd be invaded.
You started off with an armband. Then, as they got weapons and stuff, finally, you got your rifle.
Invasion paranoia spawned a litany of mind-bending nonsense. General Ironside, Commander-in-Chief, Home Forces, angrily reported,
"Suspicious men moving all night all over the country. There is signaling going on all over the place."
Charles de Gaulle broadcast his appeal from London.
This war has not been settled by the Battle of France. This is a world war.
On the day of de Gaulle's broadcast, Winston Churchill told the Commons,
"The Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin."
Japan, at war in China, was building its empire. The Soviet Union had treaties with Japan on its eastern and Germany on its western borders. Germany was building its empire in Europe. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Luxembourg, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium were all occupied. And France was conquered and divided. By the summer of 1940, Hitler had just one place left to deal with.
But if the British Empire and its commonwealths last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
Churchill said that the Battle of Britain was about to begin. He was right.
With the fall of Europe and Germany sitting on the doorstep, so to speak, Britain was the only thing that stood in the way of total German conquest of Europe.
But it would not be fought on the beaches, landing grounds, fields, streets, and hills. It would be fought in the sky.
Germany, in order to invade, had two goals: to knock out the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. And they had to attack the Air Force first, because if they went for the Navy, obviously the Air Force would defend the Navy. So that was the goal. German air superiority, knock out the RAF.
Hermann Goering commanded the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. He said,
"The Führer has ordered me to crush Britain with my Luftwaffe. I plan to have this enemy down on his knees so that an occupation can proceed without any risk."
The first phase of the Battle of Britain, the fight for air supremacy over southern England, commenced on July the 10th. Young men and their aircraft, both untested in battle, were sent up to meet waves of German bombers targeting the Channel, hoping to draw the Royal Air Force into fatal combat.
Phase 1 of the Nazi plan called for the RAF to be knocked out of the air. But the men of the RAF hadn't read the Nazi plan.
Even though you think of it as British, it really was an international force, because you had Australia, for instance, we had 30 or so pilots. You had Poles, Czechs who had come from fallen Europe. You even had 5 Americans flying in there, a couple of Jamaicans. It was an international force designed, dedicated to defending Britain. Germany had consistent waves of attacking aircraft, bombers escorted by a large number of fighter aircraft.
Hundreds of planes, bombers, fighters, dive bombers.
It really was designed to bring the RAF down as quickly as they could. They attacked the convoys in the Channel. That was the first stage of the Battle of Britain.
Goering opposed the RAF with 3 Luftflotte, numbers 2 and 3 flying out of France and Belgium, and Luftflotte 5 flying from Denmark and Norway across the North Sea. A Luftwaffe pilot thought it a marvelous sight. Wherever one looks, he said, are our aircraft. The first stage, aimed at gaining air superiority over the Channel, was dubbed Kanalkampf, Channel Fight. As well as bombs, the Luftwaffe was dropping leaflets over England. They were headed, "A last appeal to reason."
Hitler would have liked a negotiated peace, but Britain obviously wasn't going to have anything to do with that.
By the end of July, Reichsmarschall Goering was forced to revise his strategy. Failing to draw the RAF out, he would attack them directly. A coded message from Goering, intercepted by British intelligence, read,
"To all units of Luftflottes 2, 3, and 5. Within a short period, you will wipe the British Air Force from the sky. Heil Hitler!"
This new strategy was Adlerangriff, Attack of the Eagle. It would start on Adlertag, Eagle Day, August 13th, 1940. An RAF order of the day told pilots,
"The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Members of the Royal Air Force, the fate of generations lies in your hands.
August 8th, 1940, and the battle for Britain is on. Across that 21 miles of channel, that 8 short minutes of water.
Hundreds of aircraft in 4 successive assaults attempted to break the southeastern defences. Churchill's chief military assistant, General Hastings Pug Ismay, reported,
The map table showed new waves of attackers crossing the coast. Heavy fighting throughout the afternoon, and at one moment, every single squadron in the group was engaged. There was nothing in reserve.
Britain realised too, the best way to knock out a Messerschmitt, for instance, was a close quarter front-on attack. So we always hear about, you know, looking at them, staring in the whites of their eyes. But this is what was happening. They flew as close as they could and they fired head on. Really dangerous, really risky, but very effective.
On August 16th, Winston Churchill visited 11 Group headquarters in Uxbridge. He was visibly moved by what he saw, and on the 20th, rose in the House of Commons to declare that
never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
Britain's lead in radar, the opportunity to recycle downed pilots, the successful ramping up of aircraft production, the quality of the Spitfire and Hurricane aircraft, and a flexible command structure made Fighter Command a resilient and tough opponent. And at the business end was skill and courage. On August 18th, Winston Churchill had sent 150 precious tanks to Egypt, suggesting he believed the threat to the Suez Canal more real than the threat of an invasion to Britain. On the 24th, having sailed around the Cape, the tanks arrived at Port Said.
Oh, we had the small tank with 2 machine guns on, a .5 and a 303. They were quite nice for nipping about on, but as far as fighting is concerned, they were no match for the Germans, of course.
On September 13th, the Italians entered Egypt from Libya. Mussolini's move into Egypt was not his only flourish. When, in 1939, Hitler had grabbed all he wanted of Czechoslovakia, Mussolini complained,
The Italians will laugh at me. Every time Hitler takes a country, he sends me a message.
He reversed the roles, to Hitler's annoyance, on October 28th, telling Hitler,
Führer, we are on the march. Victorious Italian troops crossed the Greco-Albanian frontier at dawn today.
Italy invaded when Greece responded to Mussolini's ultimatum with a single word, Ochi, no.
Italian divisions were absolutely tiny. He talked of divisions because it sounded so grand, but most of them were no more than a couple of regiments.
A week later, the Greek army counterattacked, and a commanders' meeting discussed Germany's Mediterranean strategy. Hitler's adjutant, Gerhard Engel, admitted of the Führer.
At the moment, he does not know what he wants to do.
But because he had been, if you like, Hitler's mentor in the early days, Hitler had a sort of strange commitment to him, in a way, a genuine friendship.
2 weeks later, the Greek army defeated the Italian Ninth Army, exposing Hitler's southern flank and forcing his hand.
Mussolini's Greek campaign is a perfect example of all that could go wrong when you have a dictator who doesn't listen to his military professionals.
By the time it went wrong, the Battle of Britain was history.
The gratitude of every home in our island, in our empire, and indeed throughout the world, goes out to the British airmen who, undaunted by odds, unwearied in their constant challenge and mortal danger, are turning the tide of the world war by their prowess and by their devotion.
Between August 24th and September 3rd, the attacks launched by the Luftwaffe on airfields and aircraft factories had cost Germany 380 planes. The RAF lost 286. And then the battle changed. On September 7th, radar reported the approach of hundreds of aircraft.
375 German planes came roaring up the Thames River. The Battle of Britain became the Battle of London.
The RAF sent up 11 squadrons to intercept further attacks on airfields and installations.
Facing odds of 6, 8, 10 to 1, dove in, shouting the old hunting cry, tally-ho!
But on September 7th, airfields were not the target.
The air raid alarm went at about 11 o'clock, and we got up and walked out into the street, and one of the things we saw was above the city, the aircraft flares dropping over the city. And that's when my dad realized that we were going to be the target, which we were.
Nazi high explosive, wantonly poured down upon England, upon shops and mills, upon homes and farms.
Londoners everywhere witness scenes like these throughout the night. As in London, the people there bear the brunt of Nazi ferocity.
The first raids hit the London docks, and to those who were there, it left memories as vivid as the night sky.
If I say the sky was black, I'm not exaggerating. It was black, with the big bombers going over and darting in between with the Spitfires.
Every night for 8 weeks, 200 German bombers and more to sweep over London and deliver their deadly cargo.
The night sky above London burst into flames.
The period between September and November 1940 has been referred to as the Great Fire of London. On one night, 1,500 fires were started by German bombs.
Raids hit London, Southampton, Bristol, Cardiff, Liverpool, Manchester, and more.
German bombers came in over the city in waves of deadly efficiency.
Anti-aircraft batteries brought down one aircraft for every 30,000 shells fired. But the writer George Orwell said that, at an average cost of £5 per shell, they were well worth it for the effect on morale.
The Nazi psychology was simple and uncomplicated. Break the back of London and its overcrowded millions, and England would beg Hitler to come in and take over, if only to stop the nerve-shattering raids. Around the clock, the German planes spread a sheet of flaming death over London.
The Führer believed the bombing would drive Britain to submission, without the need for an invasion. He was wrong, and such predictions about the collapse of morale were wrong wherever bombs were dropped.
They were to perform the impossible. They were to survive.
So many civilians were killed, so much destruction. But it really, really consolidated the people.
Civilians had to be involved. They needed to feel that they were participating.
They were part of the fight. They were willing to put up with everything that was happening.
Air raids and mass bombings were intended to degrade and demoralise civilian populations, and that did not happen. The British population, broadly speaking, did remain defiant and stoical and even humorous in those circumstances.
And they knew, too, that Britain was not going to lose.
Theirs was the unquenchable spirit that triumphed over evil and sent Hitler down to defeat.
In October, the Luftwaffe lost 379 planes to the RAF's 185.
Another. And another. 169 in one day. The equivalent of 12 or 14 squadrons. How long can the Nazi Air Force stand such losses?
A German pilot described the flight back to base as being a track across waters, dotted with parachutes, pilots in their life jackets, and greasy oil slicks. By the middle of September, it was evident that victory in the air was not going to be achieved.
Had they stuck to a tactical doctrine of knocking out the Air Force and then clearing the way for an invasion, they may have had a chance. The decision to bomb London and to go further was a clear mistake. It's not precision bombing, and in terms of terrorising the population, which was one of the aims, that didn't succeed.
The Blitz would continue until May 1941, but the Battle of Britain was over.
They leveled thousands upon thousands of homes and damaged millions of others. They killed more than 40,000 men, women, and children, and seriously wounded 50,000 more. But not one single Nazi soldier set foot on British soil.
From July 10th to mid-November, total German losses were 1,818 aircraft, British 995. When Winston Churchill visited the devastated areas, he wept.
All the world that is still free marvels at the composure and fortitude with which the citizens of London are facing and surmounting the great ordeal to which they are subjected, the end of which, or the severity of which, cannot yet be foreseen.
Though Britain's immediate hopes are centered on its fighter command and the ability of the RAF to repulse Nazi air invaders, equally important in the Empire's war effort is the Royal Air Force Bomber Command.
Britain essentially stands alone with the support of the Commonwealth. All of its European allies have gone. The United Kingdom wants the support of the United States in the war. It wants to draw them in to the war. It needs to demonstrate that it is still a viable ally, that is still fighting. So it needs to take the war to the Germans.
And the phrase which fits our present sentiment is, they've got it coming to them. They, that is the Germans, have got it coming to them.
Before the end of August, Bomber Command of the RAF had begun its campaign against German cities.
Round-the-clock bombing by the RAF has recently set up new records for intensity of attack. And daylight raids have been causing ever-increasing dislocation of the German war effort in occupied territory. Great damage has been done by day and night. And we have Mr. Churchill's word for it that even this big offensive will be improved upon.
Well, the so-called area bombing, that's to say the bombing of entire cities, arose from the inability of the British Air Force to find its targets. So the best it could hope to do was to drop bombs over very large urban areas.
Mass aerial bombing allowed a new weapon, a new form of warfare to be opened, and that was economic warfare. By destroying its production facilities, its armament factories, its oil facilities, it reduced the German ability to actually fight.
Factories, warehouses, railroads, submarine bases, shipyards, docks,
airfields, and oil refineries.
And the British took the view that if you annihilated not merely the factory, but also all the infrastructure around it, then you would ensure that factory could not be easily repaired.
Each speck of light a blazing German building. Easy enough to realize the catastrophe, the concentrated chaos that is overwhelming the city below.
It's a strange dichotomy that Britain had endured the Blitz, and the Blitz was seen as actually drawing the British people together and uniting them in defiance. And yet 2 years later, it was assumed that an even heavier form of bombing campaign on Germany would break their morale. The evidence for this was quite simply non-existent.
The wartime death toll in German raids on a dozen or more British towns and cities was 60,000. The death toll from the Allied bombing offensive against Germany is estimated at 600,000.
Press home your attack. If you individually succeed, you will have delivered the most devastating blow against the very vitals of the enemy. Let him have it right on the chin.
Italian losses are put at about 60,000.
The day after Italy entered the war, June 1940, the bombs started to rain on the country.
In the Ruhr, in the Rhineland, then northern Italy. Planes of the Bomber Command have pounded away at Nazi dockyards.
Turin was bombed, Milan was bombed, and the bombs were so frequent that everyone was spending time in shelters or had transferred to the countryside.
Now is not the time, in any way, to ease up, but to put on what indeed may prove the final spurt.
500,000 Soviet civilians were killed in air raids. More than 300,000 Chinese were victims of Japanese bombing, and up to 500,000 Japanese were killed by bombs.
Families have lost everything they own. Forced evacuation has torn children from parents, husbands from wives.
We can see from the kind of homes that were wrecked how indiscriminate the attack was.
The British took a rather dim view of the civilian populations of nations and thought they would be terrorised and they would hate these stresses and strains area bombing placed on them. But that just made them all the more determined to fight and win. And that was something that the British bombing campaign never took account of.
One of the most significant differences between the ideological justifications used by the Allies and those used by the Axis powers is that the Allies didn't believe that victims that they did kill through their bombing policies needed to be wiped out so that their societies could coexist.
Hitler did. Hitler was, he said himself, fighting a race war. He announced,
"We shall strike towards the east next spring."
Part of his plan was to avoid going further west, but always to the east. He wanted to occupy the vast agricultural areas in the east that he saw as occupied by inferior Slavic peoples.
The concept of race as applied to Jewry is contentious and has changed over time. For most of Jewish history, there was never such a question.
The Nazis called the racial issue that obsessed them the Jewish problem. The document proposing the final solution to that problem was presented to Goering on March 26, 1941. Goering signed the plan on July 31st and put in charge the head of the Office of Reich Main Security, Reinhard Heydrich, one of the principal architects of the Holocaust. By then, Polish Jews had long since been imprisoned in ghettos.
The ghettos were absolutely appalling places, and as the war progressed, they became worse and worse.
30,000 people
Men, women, children, babies, pregnant women, old people, sick people, you name it, a whole population. You had to move into the poorest part of town, little shacks.
The Warsaw Ghetto contained about 500,000 people, and they were housed in an area of 1.3 square miles. That means that there were approximately 7 people to every available room.
There was very, very little difference between concentration camps and ghetto.
Prisoners, the inmates, were exposed to forced labor, to appalling housing and medical conditions, to starvation.
The daily dose of calories was about 400 calories per person per day. Later, it was reduced to 200 calories. So it was enormously low, as you would expect.
Because of the hygienic condition, typhus set in. So we had a double whammy.
This was very much intentional. This was intended by the German occupation. Firstly, because of their disregard for human life in Eastern Europe. And secondly, in order to feed the German population.
But it was a kind of transit vehicle to confine, to incarcerate ghettos, to concentrate them, to destroy the context between Jews and non-Jews, to isolate them, and to expose them to conditions where they later, once they were not anymore required as forced laborer, could be exterminated. In other words, inmates of ghettos lived on borrowed time.
In 1940, people were being killed by bombs and by murder squads. But no armies were fighting on European soil. But there was fighting in China and in Africa. In August, as bombs fell on London, Italian troops occupied British Somaliland. To oppose Italian occupation, an Allied force under General Platt entered Eritrea from Sudan. A second force, under General Sir Alan Cunningham, moved north from Kenya.
Mussolini's declaration of war found the British forces in Egypt ready for him. Every man in the army eager to get at the enemy after the many months of training and the long period of waiting to be properly in the war.
Cliff Everton had enlisted in his native South Africa.
We travelled hundreds of miles, and we did most of that on foot.
This will give you an idea of the tough country the British troops of Wavell's army tackled in their drive.
We had troop carriers, but the terrain in that part of Africa was mostly desert, so you spent half the time pushing your truck out of the sand. We went into our first action. Of course, we were all new recruits, haven't a clue what was going on. Even the officers were as green as grass.
The force advancing into Eritrea faced stern resistance and terrible terrain. General Platt described their battle for Karen.
A ding-dong battle, a soldier's battle. Fought against an enemy infinitely superior in numbers, on ground of his own choosing, which gave him every bit of observation against the movement of our troops.
Indian troops climbed the rugged heights from which Italians poured fire down on them. Overcoming their enemy in what General Wavell told Churchill was a tough nut to crack.
Does you good to see these gents with their hands up, doesn't it? And how about the Hun? It's better still to see him making the old familiar sign of camarade.
Cunningham's force took 50,000 prisoners, gained more than 930,000 square kilometers at the cost of 135 men killed and 4 captured.
With indomitable courage, they drove the Italians foot by foot from their position, supposed to be impregnable. Casualties are high, but the haul in prisoners is immense.
A British veteran of the fight said,
"Those who fought on other fronts know that nothing was worse than Keren."
General Platt had told his men that the battle
will be won by the side which lasts longest. I know you will last longer than they do, and I promise you, I will last longer than my opposite.
They lasted longer, but their war was just beginning.
All the soldiers that were involved in the East Africa campaign were boarded onto troops' ships, and we sailed right up the Red Sea, right up to Egypt.
For many, the war would continue along the North African littoral and on into Italy. They would not stop fighting until the war ended. But by then, it would be a very different war. A war in which Britain would have to fight in Europe, in Africa, and in Asia. This was the nightmare that, in 1940, made Winston Churchill, the great enemy of appeasement, yield to Japanese pressure and close the Burma Road.
The Burma Road, which was essential to get supplies to the 45 Chinese divisions fighting the Japanese and to ensure that they were kept in the war. They were flying supplies over the hump, over the Himalayas.
On the day the Burma Road was closed, the military party in Japan triumphed, and General Hideki Tojo became Minister for War. Little more than a week later, the Japanese government announced plans for a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere.
Japan was a militarist regime, and what that meant was that really the admirals and the generals had taken over every aspect of Japanese government, politics, foreign policy. They'd seized control of the country and its destiny.
Kuribayashi had volunteered to fight for his emperor as soon as he was old enough.
Japan had to develop the continent. In Manchuria, Japan had to control China. That's what my father said. There was no issue. In my village, I was called a patriotic child. I thought I should go and join the war against China.
The Emperor Hirohito observed,
Premier Konoye seems to consider that the China incident will not be settled easily and favors advancing to the south.
On September 27th, Japan signed a tripartite pact with Rome and Berlin.
The three aggressor nations of Europe and Asia joined forces. The German Führer was well disposed toward making an alliance with any nation which would help further his own greedy aims.
The rejoicing Japanese knew that after their 350 years of waiting, their day of destiny was at hand.
Haro Yoshimichi, president of Japan's Privy Council, understood the path the nation was on.
The pact is a treaty of alliance with the United States as its target. I assume that the United States will put economic pressure on Japan. She will probably ban the export of oil and iron.
The Axis controlled just 3% of the world's oil production and 4% of its refinery capacity. Stalin would later say that the war had been decided by engines and octane. When German troops entered Romania, plugging a gap in their eastern front, they secured control of Ploesti, the productive Romanian oil field that was the source of 94% of German oil imports. On the day after the move into Ploesti, President Roosevelt said,
"The time may be coming when the Germans and the Japs will do some fool thing that will put us in. That's the only real danger of our getting in."
Following the announcement of the Tripartite Pact, Churchill reopened the Burma Road and the British government granted Chiang Kai-shek a £10 million loan.
I think everyone in Britain regarded the event as definitely good news. And now war supplies are steadily on their way to the Chinese army again.
But the communists and nationalists agreeing that they would fight the Japanese rather than fighting each other, China's politics changed as well. It didn't become democratic in the sort of liberal sense. There was more pluralism. There was more opportunity for people to debate new ideas about the kind of society that would be constructed after the war was over.
In Vienna on the 20th of November 1940, with Hitler in attendance, Hungary joined the Axis. Romania was 3 days behind, Slovakia 1 day later. On December 18th, Hitler issued Directive 21.
The German armed forces must be prepared, even before the conclusion of war against England, to crush Soviet Russia in a rapid campaign.
They start the planning for an operation against the Soviet Union, still really thinking about the British. The idea is if they can knock out the Soviet Union, the British will realize they have no more allies left, not even a potential ally in the form of the Soviet Union. And then finally, the British will see reason as the Germans see it and make some kind of peace terms. So they're still thinking just very strategically.
By the end of January 1941, the Japanese Ministry of Finance had authorized the printing of occupation money for the Philippines, British Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. On February 1st, rice rationing was introduced, and the ambassador to Vichy was instructed to tell the Vichy government that the Japanese army would push into Indochina, placing Japanese aircraft within reach of Malaya and the East Indies. The American Secretary of State pressed Roosevelt for fresh sanctions, which the US Navy War Plans Division warned
would probably result in a fairly early attack by Japan on Malaya and the Netherlands East Indies, and possibly involve the United States in early war in the Pacific.
So America imposes these restrictions on Japan. And for Japan, that just underlines everything they've always been worried about. The fact that somebody out there can cut off our oil, which we need. The fact that somebody out there, another power, can restrict our capital, can inhibit our exports. In a sense, it sort of crystallizes the feelings of insecurity that have become increasingly evident in Japan throughout the interwar years.
At sea, an American warship is the stage for historical drama almost without parallel in world diplomacy.
In August 1941, Churchill and Roosevelt met for the first time as wartime leaders. Churchill sailed aboard the Royal Navy's finest, the Prince of Wales, to meet the president at Placentia Bay in Newfoundland.
The two greatest leaders of the freedom-loving world are ready for the historic conference.
When Churchill went to meet Franklin Roosevelt, it was as though somebody said, it was as though he was going to meet God. He regarded Roosevelt as somebody, the only person really, who could definitely save Britain.
It was difficult for countries to know each other. Imagine what it's like with no television, no internet. If you're an American president and you met a British prime minister, you didn't necessarily have a lot in common.
The most impressive scene witnessed on the deck of the Prince of Wales was the service. A service in which every man present, from Premier and President to ordinary seaman, dedicated himself anew to the securing, with God's help, of freedom for the whole world.
The leaders issued a press release that has become known as the Atlantic Charter. We fight according to the Atlantic Charter, not for territory and power, but for rights and principles. Some have been ignored, some trashed, but none could be unsaid. They survive still as the basis of the Charter of the United Nations. Churchill's deputy, Clement Attlee, broadcast news of the Charter, which greatly disappointed those listening on the radio. The United States was not joining the battle. Four months after Churchill had sailed to Placentia Bay aboard HMS Prince of Wales, she was sunk by Japanese aircraft off the coast of Malaya. Churchill said, "I never received a more direct shock." The sinking of two of the Royal Navy's finest ships closed a tumultuous year. British troops from Egypt arrived in Greece at the beginning of 1941.
Once Italy drew Greece into the war, that drew the British into Greece. Once the British were in Greece, then Germany's vital interests in the south were in jeopardy. Therefore, they had to now counter the British threat.
We battled in Greece. Most of our tanks were we had to destroy ourselves because we didn't have spares. Just north of Thebes somewhere. And the planes came over and we piled into a ditch. They caught it with a bomb. And then the order came through, every man for himself. The Greek government had collapsed. So that was it.
A month after British troops arrived in Greece, Germany invaded and dismembered Yugoslavia, which surrendered on April 17th. On April 27th, with German troops in Athens, Greece surrendered.
Their courage, their endurance, their repeated proofs of an unconquerable spirit, their sufferings, their sacrifices will not be in vain.
After British troops were evacuated to Crete, Ultra Intercepts, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, warned of an impending invasion. German parachutists descended on the island, harnessed by a single strap to a canopy over which they had no control.
German paratroopers dropped from a very low height, that they were subject to a great deal of small arms fire and suffered very heavily on the descent.
Poor communication meant that the defenders did not capitalize on their success.
These pictures tell their own story. The Luftwaffe bombing Greece almost at will because we hadn't enough planes with which to beat them back. More long-range fighters, more bombers, more planes and machines of every kind are needed now.
Other failures followed, and on May 27th, General Freyberg, Allied commander, declared the battle lost. Staff Sergeant Raymond Ryan was on Crete.
I woke to find white flags fluttering everywhere. On inquiring as to what was up, I was told that HQ had gone during the night, leaving orders to surrender.
Impatient for orders to go in and evacuate the troops, Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham advised,
"If, gentlemen, you order the army in Crete to surrender, the fleet will still go there to bring off the Marines."
The Germans now had Crete, they now had its airfields, they could now project naval and air power across the Mediterranean.
A week after the evacuation, British and Free French forces invaded Syria and Lebanon. James Gordon was with the 2-31st Australian Battalion. His Victoria Cross citation said,
He crept forward, over an area swept by machine gun and grenade fire, and killed the 4 machine gunners with bayonet.
On May 10, 1941, Adolf Hitler's deputy Rudolf Hess had flown to Scotland. Running out of fuel, he was obliged to parachute to Earth, broke an ankle, and was arrested by a startled ploughman. His mission sent Hitler into a rage. Hess had taken it upon himself to warn the British of what was about to happen.
The hour has come in which it is necessary to go into action against the conspiracy of Jewish Anglo-Saxon warmongers and Jewish power holders of the Bolshevik Center in Moscow.
The hour was June 22nd, the 129th anniversary of Napoleon's invasion of Russia. 151 German divisions, supported by 40 from the Axis allies, more than 3 million men, stormed forward in 3 giant thrusts, aimed at Leningrad, Kiev, and Smolensk. British experts gave the Red Army 10 days. American experts between 1 and 3 months. History tells a different story. German forces have swept across Europe, isolating the United Kingdom. Switzerland and Sweden are neutral, Spain sympathetic, the rest of the continent occupied or allied. Hitler rules an empire and governs a population greater than that of the USA. He turns east, demanding a different kind of war. A race war. A war of annihilation. Between January and June 1941, 17,000 trains carried German armies towards the Soviet Union. They included 3,000 troops designated to follow the combat units and conduct, in the words of Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer of the SS,
the annihilation campaign against the racial enemy.
On January 9th, 1941, the Führer told his generals,
"The enormous Russian space holds immeasurable riches. I am convinced our attack will sweep over them like a hailstorm."
Hitler, in his second book, wrote with envy of the American ability to exterminate the Native Americans. He starts to look to the Ukraine as the breadbasket, which will provide wheat and meat and milk.
Following a meeting with Hitler on March 3rd, General Alfred Jodl, head of the operations staff, noted agreement that, following conquest of the Soviet Union,
the Jewish Bolshevik intelligentsia must be eliminated.
Well, really, the invasion of the Soviet Union is both a conventional war and it's an ideological war. There is no restraint in this war. This is a racial, ideological war.
On March 30th, Hitler told 200 of his senior commanders at a planning conference,
"This is a war of extermination. We do not wage war to preserve the enemy.
After the war, German generals that were in the British or American captivity, they created this myth of a clean Wehrmacht, that the army never took part in these crimes. But the truth is that the army from the very beginning executed these orders.
The criminal orders followed. The Commissar order was an instruction to shoot a particular class of prisoner of war at the site and almost at the moment of capture.
Hitler thought that the commissars were the driving power, the ideological cells in this organism, in this body of Red Army, right? So they had to be killed straight away.
Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed the final draft of the order.
As a matter of principle, political commissars will be shot at once.
The people who came here as the harbingers of the European idea, they turned into criminals, which fought Soviet people, which burned the whole villages. They killed women, children.
In April, Walter von Brautigsch, Army Commander-in-Chief, spoke for the general conviction.
Fierce border battles anticipated, duration up to 4 weeks. Afterwards, only minor resistance is to be expected.
Minutes of a German planning meeting on May 2nd noted,
"The war can only be waged if the entire Wehrmacht is fed from Russia. As a result, tens of millions of people will doubtlessly starve to death."
This expected outcome was confirmed by the Economic Policy Guidelines for Economic Organization East, published on May 23rd.
Many tens of millions of people will become superfluous and will have to die or migrate to Siberia.
According to the German Plan Ost about Belarus territory, Germans plans to only 25% of population should remain here. 75% should be killed or removed to other territories.
In one of the documents of General Plan Ost, it was written that it's too expensive to kill all Slavic people. We don't need to. We need to keep some of them, but other they will die from starvation or, so it was quite, practical.
So they quite coldly and calculatedly intend to murder many more millions of people than were actually murdered, in the Holocaust, 6 million in the Holocaust. We're talking 30 million as a result of the hunger plan.
On June 11th, Stalin received warning of imminent attack from a Soviet agent in Berlin known as Starshiner. He rejected every warning.
He was convinced that the more that he heard from warnings from the British about German preparations, that this was a British plot to provoke him into a war with Hitler purely for British interests.
Hitler, confident of the success of the invasion, ordered a shift of weapons production from the army to the Air Force, anticipating resumption of the war against Britain following the Soviet Union's defeat. He then took what he called
the hardest decision of my life.
The signal Dortmund has a claim to being the word that separates then from now. Dortmund triggered the launch of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, on June 22nd at 3:30 a.m., half an hour after Joseph Stalin had gone to bed. One of the soldiers in one of the 166 invading divisions recalled,
"We marched into Russia. We had been told that Russians had attacked us, so off we went to teach them a lesson."
Stalin had disregarded over 80 warnings about Barbarossa and 180 violations of Soviet airspace in the preceding 3 months. Then, a forward position radioed,
"We are being fired on. What are we to do?"
With the familiar Panzer technique, which had never before failed, Nazi Germany launched the cane which was to overwhelm the Soviet and provide Hitler with a full entry into Moscow long before summer ended.
The entire German forces, including their allies Romania, Finland, and various other contributing nations, came to about 4 million men that was going to cross the Soviet border and head towards their targets in the Soviet Union.
German bombers struck 66 Soviet aerodromes, destroying more than 1,200 Soviet aircraft on the ground. Bombs fell on towns. Yuri Kuzhnikov, who served in the Red Army, remembered,
"We woke up because of the noise in the sky. There were planes and they were flying and swooping down and nosedived. We thought it was part of the training, but it was Germans."
The invasion was initially enormously successful for the Germans. They cut through the Soviet defenses. They almost destroyed the Soviet Air Force on the ground before they could even get aircraft in the air.
When Georgy Zhukov, chief of the General Staff, phoned the Kremlin, he was told that Stalin was asleep.
"Wake him immediately. The Germans are bombing our cities."
By nightfall on the 22nd, Italy and Romania had declared war on the Soviet Union. Finland joined in on the 26th, and Hungary on the 27th. The German army in the east was supported by the Dutch, French, Danish, Croatian, Slovakian, Hungarian, Romanian, and Spanish volunteers. Army groups North, Center, and South struck out for their objectives. Group North, tasked with the capture of Leningrad, South with Kiev, and Center, the largest formation with as much armor as the other groups combined, driving for Smolensk.
They are just driving in. This is a real problem because they don't have any infantry support. They will close the encirclement at Minsk. They will ultimately capture some 300,000 Soviet prisoners of war, but the bulk of the German infantry is coming much slower behind them.
On June 23rd, Goebbels wrote in his diary,
"We must win, and quickly. The public mood is one of slight depression.
After years of scientific military preparation, in accordance with a deliberate plan of conquest, and with the avowed object of enslaving all less powerful peoples, the German machine has smashed its subhuman way across the face of Europe."
In many parts of the Ukraine, the Baltic states, and even Western Russia, the elders greeted the invaders as liberators. Empire was there for the taking, as Field Marshal Fedor von Bock observed.
"This people would not be difficult to lead."
But leadership was not in the lexicon of Nazi racial theory. Himmler understood the aims.
The purpose of the Russian campaign is to decimate the Slavic population by 30 millions.
The problem was that the Germans, by the end of 1941, with their disgusting policy, they turned the population against them. And I think that was one of the main factors that contributed to their defeat.
The killings began at once. On June 24th, a Gestapo official in Tilsit ordered the shooting of 200 male Jews. A further 201 Jews were killed in Gargstad, 214 in Kretinga on the 25th, 111 in Palanga on the 27th, escalating to 30,000 at Kaunas between the 4th and 6th of July.
The Holocaust does not start in Auschwitz or in a camp, but it starts on the killing fields of the occupied Soviet Union.
Within 3 days of the invasion, the Luftwaffe was able to switch to a ground support role. The Red Army Air Force would lose 21,200 aircraft in 1941, from an initial strength of 32,100. Evgeny Kuguchin lived close to the border.
Straight away, the preparation began. Not too far from my village, they started building a reserve airport. They gave an order to every collective farm to find people and horses, so we were surfacing the field for a future airport.
On June 26th, as Pravda described the conflict as a fatherland war, von Manstein's surging 56th Motorized Corps had to pause at the western Dvina River and wait.
It was a modern army, tanks, motorized infantry. They're thrusting forward, destroying, breaking these echelons. But 80%, the great bulk, was still infantry that would march on and on and on, just like back in the days of Napoleon.
By June 27th, elements of the 221st Division watched without protest the slaughter of 2,000 Jews at Bialystok by the 309th Reserve Police Battalion, and German tanks linked up east of Minsk. A day later, the city surrendered. When Himmler visited Bialystok in July, he complained,
"The police rounded up too few Jews."
A week after the launch of Barbarossa, the vanguard was almost a third of the way to Moscow. But the 7th Panzer Division, spearheading Army Group Center's push, reported a 50% loss of Mark II and Mark III tanks and an unsustainable 75% loss of Mark IV models, mainly through mechanical failure.
As you drive over it with a tank and then a truck and then a tank and then a truck, it kicks up an enormous amount of dust. And all of this is going into 1930s, 1940s air filters. It's going straight into the engines.
The first partisan battle of the war took place around Pinsk on the 28th of June.
The path in the swamps was very narrow. And if the German column, need to pass through the swamps and through the forests, the partisans needed to shoot the first car and the last car. Germans paralyzed. They jump in the swamp, they die.
A directive issued on the 29th in the names of Stalin and Molotov called for people
to create intolerable conditions for the enemy and all of his henchmen.
Fighting against partisans for the Germans always means, well, if we find a gun or two in a village, then we consider the village to be a partisan village and we'll burn the village and we'll kill all the people. So in Belarus, we have more than 1 million non-Jewish inhabitants who are actually killed.
In the first winter of war, several hundreds thousand small children, younger than 1 year, their mothers didn't have milk, and there was now a substitute of mother's milk, because it was impossible for them to survive.
In Soviet Ukraine, Soviet Belarus, and the Leningrad district, where Stalin had starved and shot 4 million people in the previous 8 years, German forces would starve and shoot a far greater number, and in less than half the time. On July 3rd, in his first public speech since the invasion, Stalin said,
"Comrades, citizens, brothers and sisters, men of our army and navy, my words are addressed to you, dear friends."
Stalin had never spoken like that before. He had never called the people his brothers and sisters. Now he told them,
"We must call on all workers to commence the struggle in order to defend their freedom, their honor, and their motherland with their bodies in our patriotic war."
And everywhere throughout their vast country, the people of Russia responded. Russian factories, already working overtime, even increased the tempo of their war production.
he did not invoke loyalty to the Soviet state, the party, or the revolution. His appeal was to Russian nationalism. The day he spoke, Halder, German Chief of Staff, wrote,
"It is no exaggeration to say that the war against Russia has been won."
On July 8th, Goebbels declared,
"No one doubts anymore our victory in Russia."
In the first 3 weeks, the attack advanced 480 kilometers. The Red Army lost 1 million killed, wounded, missing, or captured, and about 10,000 tanks and 4,000 aircraft. It was astonishing, but not enough.
They've taken in the north, Volokolamsk, they've taken in the center, Moskhaevsk, and they've taken in the south, Kaluga. All the 3 arteries that are leading toward Moscow, but they are still not at Moscow.
The crucial city of Smolensk, halfway between Minsk and Moscow, fell on July 16th. Lev Kazevich served in the Red Army.
Main battles were going in Smolensk, and we were surrounded. I was wounded, I was deaf, I lost my hearing. Our sergeant major was wrapped up with our regimental color, and some fishermen helped us to cross the river, and we got to the bank where our troops were.
All the history books will tell you, Battle of Minsk, great success, 300,000 prisoners of war. Battle of Smolensk, something similar, about 300,000 prisoners of war. The problem is, they have not done what Barbarossa stipulates. They have not been able to eliminate the Red Army or Soviet resistance at the borders.
Hitler's confidence was untroubled. On the 16th, he said,
"We have now to face the task of cutting the giant cake according to our needs. We shall never withdraw from these areas. In future, there are never to be any but German soldiers west of the Urals."
And he added,
"The war against the partisans has its advantages. It enables us to exterminate all those who oppose us."
So Himmler ramped up the manpower deployed to the task of shooting non-combatants.
You then get a radicalization of orders being issued further down the chain of command. An increase in the manpower in the rear areas in the Soviet Union to combat partisans. And the main increase in manpower is the SS battalions who were sent then to the east.
By July 18th, an Einsatzgruppen report could advise that 3,302 Jews had been
liquidated in the course of cleansing operations on the Soviet-Lithuanian border.
Peter Bzhosky was a Soviet soldier.
First time in our life, we saw how people were killed. Germans killed everyone, and that anti-tank trench was filled with human bodies. We saw there was bodies of toddlers.
On July 19th, Shana Graham, who lived in the Preili shtetl in Latvia, wrote,
"An order has been issued that Jews must wear a yellow distinguishing mark."
On the 27th, she wrote,
"All the Jews in Devinskaya Street are ordered to put on their best clothes. In the afternoon, chased out beyond the cemetery and shot there. This is terrible. We did not expect things to end this way."
On August 8th,
"No one knows when our sufferings will end. I feel as though the next awful thing is getting closer and closer to me."
On the 9th, Shana Graham's family was murdered. All the Jews of Preili were murdered, all 1,500 of them. Shana did not die that day. Shana Graham was kept back by the Einsatzgruppe commander for his amusement and not killed until he was done with her on the 16th. She was 15 years old. By July 20th, Admiral Canaris, chief of German military intelligence, reported that it was
increasingly evident that the Russian campaign is not going by the book.
Barbarossa was planned to be a quick war, but the truth is that the Germans could never reach what they had in mind, so that meant that they're trapped in the east.
On the 21st, Moscow was bombed for the first time, as eyewitnesses recalled.
At 2200 hours, an air attack started. That's how, for the first time in my life, I saw an air attack on Moscow. As it became dark, we went to check on windows of buildings. Every single window had to be blacked out.
The first major Soviet counteroffensive was launched on the 23rd at Smolensk. Vasily Pronin was one of the raw recruits.
We didn't have much of war experience at that time. We were very scared. But if you could manage your fears and stay focused, you could be a good soldier.
So the unexceptional fourth week of the invasion ended. On July 24th, Goebbels confessed,
"One is gradually becoming aware that the Eastern campaign is no stroll to Moscow."
When the Soviet Union did not collapse quickly, suddenly Hitler's lightning war, his quick war plan, fell into disarray. There was no plan B.
Two days later, July 26th, Hitler complained,
"The Russians simply do not know when they are defeated."
Despite Russia's loss of her best agricultural areas, her most thoroughly developed industrial plants, millions of her people, thousands of her tanks and her planes, despite everything, the dread Nazi Blitz had spluttered, stumbled, and finally died.
On the 27th, an order was read out concerning General Pavlov, his chief of staff, General Klimovskik, and the entire staff responsible for the failure of the Red Army to defend Bialystok-Minsk. They were all to be shot, which they were.
In Stalin's opinion, it was a very reasonable thing. All the Soviet generals should know that if they fail to implement his orders, they would be punished.
The next day, Soviet High Command Order 227 instructed not a step back. On the 30th, Hitler Directive 34 ordered Army Group Center to go over to the defensive. On the 31st, Goebbels admitted,
"It is clear that we have underestimated Bolshevism."
Expected to conquer an area 20 times that of the land occupied in Western Europe, Operation Barbarossa launched with only 10% more men and 30% more tanks. Not for the first time, as Field Marshal Erich von Manstein confessed, an invader had failed to grasp the vastness of the land.
Everyone was captivated by the endlessness of the landscape. The distant horizon seemed like some mountain ridge behind which a paradise might beckon, but it only stretched on and on.
As General Halder wrote in his diary, "We are lost in the Soviet plains."
The invading force suffered the greatest number of casualties while advancing. More than 500,000 wiped off the strength. And as the invasion advanced, Soviet industry retreated.
As the German forces were pushing towards Moscow, the Soviet Union was already evacuating factories, government departments, huge resources to the east.
Stalin's policy of the scorched earth will deprive Hitler of any loot.
Between July and October 1941, more than 1,500 factories were transported east by train. 2,593 industrial units removed beyond the Urals and out of harm's way.
And that's what you get with the command economy, that you can just order a factory to move, provide the trains, and off it goes to the Urals, and you're in production again. But at enormous cost of sacrifice to the Russian people.
25 million people were shipped east and set to work 18-hour days, with 1 day off a month. In one place, 8,000 female workers lived in holes bored in the ground. The scale of civilian suffering everywhere was unimaginable.
In 1941, the biggest tragedy of this war started, the siege of Leningrad.
The almost 900-day siege claimed 1 million lives, more than the combined British and American death toll for the entire war. Diarists recorded the fate of the city as it ran out of water, of power, and of matches. One said that the living had not the strength to bury the dead. In September, panzer divisions met up at Lochwitza, encircling an army which, on the 26th of September, surrendered 655,000 Russian prisoners.
During the first 5-6 months of the war, almost 2.5 million people, prisoners of war, died.
57.5% of Soviet prisoners of war died in captivity. The death toll for British and American prisoners of the Germans was 3.5%.
Roughly 3 million Soviet prisoners of war who die in German hands simply because the Germans say, well, we won't feed them. So they put them in a POW camp and then let them starve.
You could dig a hole in the ground for yourself and live there. That's how they treated prisoners of war.
We have camps where 100,000 Soviet prisoners of war are in there, and 2 months later they are all dead because they have all been starved to death. And who is commanding this? The German army.
A Kiev diarist said,
"There is total famine. They probably want to give us a slow death. Obviously, it is inconvenient to shoot everybody."
When Hitler ordered the resumption of the advance on Moscow, Operation Typhoon, his infantry division had been reduced to 50% of their original strength, and the fighting vehicle strength of the Panzer Division similarly weakened. In a radio broadcast, he said,
"Today begins the last great decisive battle of the war, the final tremendous blow which, before the onset of winter, will lead to the destruction of the enemy."
Joseph Goebbels was poetically jubilant.
"The eastern continent lies like a limp virgin in the mighty arms of the German Mars."
proof of the failure of Operation Barbarossa is Operation Typhoon. The fact that the Germans have to come up with a whole new campaign geared to begin as late as October, which is long after the war should be won.
Early on October 5th, Nikolai Spitov, the Moscow air commander, reported that a column of German tanks was advancing along the Uknovo highway, 100 kilometers from the walls of the Kremlin. After inspecting the defenses, Zhukov told Stalin,
"All routes to Moscow are open. The weak covering forces cannot be guaranteed against the sudden appearance of enemy tanks."
On the 15th, Stalin ordered the evacuation of Moscow, but announced that he would remain in the capital.
Stalin's presence in the city during the Battle of Moscow is considered by some historians one of the great turning points of the Second World War.
So the leader is extremely important. The leader can construct these images, can communicate this, but the leader has a lot of work to do here. People, of course, can buy into it or not.
Lavrentiy Beria, sadistic head of Stalin's secret police, was in a panic.
How are we going to defend Moscow? We have absolutely nothing at all. We have been overwhelmed. We shall be shot down like partridges.
Vasily Pronin was with the Red Army.
Tula was a southern point of Moscow's defense. It was planned that the 50th Army would defend the city, but that army was surrounded in Bryansk. By order, all men from Tula, except bakers and men from the armory, had to go and defend Tula.
Gunther Blumentritt was chief of staff of the German Fourth Army. He saw
Russian workers poured out of the factories and fought with their hammers and tools in defense of their city.
By October 16th, 15 centimeters of snow blanketed the entire countryside. And General Hoffmann von Waldo lamented,
"Our wildest dreams have been washed out by rain and snow."
The weather has changed, and this is this famous period of the Rasputitsa, this deep liquid mud. But I wouldn't overstate that.
Of course, German generals blamed Russian weather and frost. But to be honest, it was not a state secret of Russia that we've got frosts in December and in January. The roads were never good in Russia. It was not a secret.
On November 12th, the temperature on the Moscow front dropped to -12 degrees Celsius, and frostbite and more began to spread through the invaders, who had not been equipped for the winter. On October 12th, 1941, General Heinz Guderian recorded a temperature of -52 Celsius. Soup froze in the bowl, and bowels froze in the latrine, killing the man with his pants around his ankles.
It's -40. They cannot stay in the open, right? So they will just drive the Russian civilians out of their small huts, and they will just live there. And that meant that a lot of these people just died. And no one knows how many perished because of that.
At the end of October, the Red Army hit back. Vasily Pronin was with the Red Army.
On the 30th of October, the first tank attack started. We destroyed 31 German tanks, but it was a very hard battle. It took many lives.
Konev's Kalinin Army Group, northwest of Moscow, moved on November 5th. Zhukov's Western Army Group launched the main attack one day later, the 6th. By the 16th, the panzer group that had bridged the Moscow-Volga Canal had been pushed back. The German 9th Army had been pushed from Kalinin, and Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group was being pressed by Golikov's 10th Army.
When they launched their invasion, they had a superiority in numbers over the Soviets of 1.4 to 1. By the time they reached Moscow in late November, early December 1941, the Soviets outnumbered them 1.2 to 1.
On December 13th, 1941, the 6th Panzer Division reported that it only had 350 riflemen and no tanks. On the 16th, 7th Panzer was down to 200 men, 10 vehicles, and no heavy tanks. 3rd Panzergruppe reported,
Discipline is breaking down. More and more soldiers are heading west on foot without weapons.
A Soviet commander in the 19th Rifle Brigade recalled,
The Germans in July 1941 were confident, strong, tall men. But later on, they became miserable, crooked, snotty, wrapped in woolen kerchiefs stolen from old women in villages.
The implications of the failure of 1941 will roll on into every other operation throughout the rest of the war, and it is unambiguously the turning point.
And yet, with his troops being pushed back, Hitler said,
Now it is impossible for us to lose this war.
He was reacting to the news of Pearl Harbor. At 06:15 local time on December 7th, 1941, the first wave of Japanese aircraft took off from their carriers, positioned some 320 kilometers north of Hawaii. Robert Eakin of the U.S. Navy was aboard his ship.
We were tied up at the submarine base when the Japanese hit. I was having a chat with the first lieutenant. He said that they're kind of early this morning. We were thinking about the Army Air Force. They used to have maneuvers on Sunday mornings. Then pretty soon we saw a bomb drop, and he said that this isn't the Army Air Force, so some general quarters and everybody headed for their battle stations.
At 0750 hours, the first wave of Japanese aircraft, 43 fighters, 51 dive bombers, 70 torpedo bombers, and 50 ordinary bombers, flying in layers from 3,000 to 4,500 meters, appeared over Hawaii.
We went up to our battle stations and fired at planes coming over. And it went on for a couple hours. Me and my gunner got credit for a plane and a half. How they figure, I don't know.
Japanese planes attacked the airfields at Wheeler, Kaneohe, and Hickam, and launched torpedoes at the naval squadron of 94 warships and auxiliary vessels at anchor, including 8 battleships in Battleship Row.
We saw the Arizona get hit. A lot of the guys were caught in fires and jumped over the side. Some of them drowned, some of them burned to death. But I was one of the lucky ones.
One of the Japanese pilots described the scene.
The smoke and flame erupted together. It was a mean-looking red flame, the kind that powder produces. And I knew at once that a big powder magazine had exploded.
4 out of 5 men aboard the Arizona were killed. 1,100 out of the total of 2,403 fatalities on the day. Surprise was complete. Within a few minutes, 5 battleships, 2 light cruisers, and an old target battleship had been hit, and almost all the US aircraft on the ground wiped out.
Pearl Harbor was the key. Knock out the fleet, the battleships, and they assumed carriers located at Pearl Harbor, so that they would then be free at the same time to invade Malaya, to seize Southeast Asia.
The Japanese would never have attacked the Americans if they didn't think that the British and the Americans would have been tied down in Europe.
By 1000 hours, it was all over. The Japanese plan appeared to have succeeded, and at a cost of only 29 aircraft and 5 mini-submarines. But a pair of vital targets, the oil storage tanks and the American aircraft carriers, which were at sea during the attack, had been missed. Americans who would serve in the war remembered the day it arrived in their country.
There was a skating rink at 60th Street and the Boulevard. It was about 2:30 in the afternoon, a loudspeaker can come on, and it said, everybody were closed and go home. The Japanese just attacked Pearl Harbor. And that's how I heard about Pearl Harbor.
I was hanging out on the corner like we did in them days, and we heard that Pearl Harbor was attacked. Nobody knew where Pearl Harbor was. Never heard of it before.
In the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, American recruiting officers had to remain open throughout the night.
Remember Pearl Harbor became the sort of rallying cry of the American people, much like Remember the Alamo. It really rallied the American people around the cause.
I remember it very clearly because at the time there was a football game going on in Chicago. When it came over the news, the amazing thing was that the next day, hundreds of boys left immediately to join the Army.
Tactically, it was very effective, tremendous success. Politically, it was a disaster because it united the American people behind all-out war.
On December 8th, Breckinridge Long at the US State Department said,
"It is the worst day in American history. All day we have been in hectic steps of transition from a peace basis to a war basis."
On December 8th, Roosevelt addressed Congress.
I think he deserves recognition as the greatest president of the 20th century and the 21st because he was equal to this moment.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
If you listen to his voice in that remarkable speech, which I think is one of the greatest speeches of the 20th century, he is deeply, deeply angry.
Congress voted in favor of war by 470 votes to 1. Jeanette Rankin, the pacifist congresswoman from Montana, demurred.
As a woman, I can't go to war, and I refuse to send anyone else.
When the Congress voted, the US Army was barely 100,000 strong. When Japan signed the surrender, aboard the USS Missouri, the United States had equipped, trained, and put into uniform almost 15 million military personnel. War, on an unimaginable scale, had been unleashed. Basking in early success, the Japanese described themselves as being victory drunk, and Admiral Mitomi Ugaki declared on New Year's Day, 1942,
"The main thing is to win. and we surely will win.
But on May 12th, little over 4 months later, and following the Battle of the Coral Sea, Admiral Ugaki struck a different note in his diary.
A dream of great success has been shattered.
The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, was a shock, but not quite a surprise. In China, many considered it a blessing, but China's war was far from over.
When we think about the experience that we associate with the war in the West, even something as iconic as the Blitz in London, we should remember that those experiences were not just shared in China, but often the Chinese were there first.
The news of Pearl Harbor was also greeted with glee by the British Prime Minister, who was spending that weekend at his official country home.
When the news of Pearl Harbor came through, he said he went to bed that evening and he slept the sleep of the just and the saved, because he knew that America coming into the war in that way would tip the balance completely against Nazi Germany.
"4 days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler announced to the Reichstag that Germany had declared war on the USA. Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, asked,
"When has a Jewified nation like that ever produced fighters?"
Hitler said,
"Everything about the behavior of American society reveals that it's half Judaized and the other half negrified. How can one expect a state like that to hold together?"
The American president spoke to the American people and to the world in his State of the Union address on January 6th.
In fulfilling my duty to report upon the State of the Union, I am proud to say to you that the spirit of the American people was never higher than it is today.
Hitler thought that even if America came into the war, it would be so preoccupied with the Pacific and with Japan, it would have little time and energy and resource to apply to Europe. It's totally the other way when it comes to it. Roosevelt commits its forces first to the European war. It is a remarkable thing.
In the address, Roosevelt told the world that the United States would produce 60,000 aircraft in 1942 and 125,000 in 1943, 45,000 tanks in 42, and 75,000 in 43.
This will give Japanese and the Nazis a little idea of just what they accomplished in the attack at Pearl Harbor.
I suppose you could say that Roosevelt had charisma. He had this ability to speak to people. But I think what made him different from people like Hitler or Mussolini was that he believed in democratic institutions. He always accepted that he worked within the bounds of the American Constitution.
The president was determined that the production figures in his Union address would be achieved or bettered. He sent for a businessman, Donald Nelson, executive vice president of Sears Roebuck. Roosevelt set up a new authority, the War Production Board. He asked the man from Sears Roebuck if he approved of the name. Nelson said it was fine. Roosevelt said,
I'm glad you approve, because you are the chairman of the War Production Board.
Donald Nelson powered up an industrial base, which was already dominant.
In the time the Japanese built one aircraft carrier, the Americans built 24. There is no way that they could match that. In modern warfare, it's all about manufacturing ability and logistics, and the Americans could overwhelm the Japanese.
Americans are preparing with all possible speed to take their places. Workers in the mills and the mines are laboring long hours under great pressure to turn out the weapons and the equipment without which the war cannot be won.
Once Donald Nelson went to work, the transformation was extraordinary. In 1941, American dockyards produced 794,000 tons of shipping. In the following 3 years, they produced 21 million tons. In 1940, the United States of America produced 2,141 aircraft. In 1944, it produced 96,318. By 1943, 18 American shipyards were together producing 3 14,000-ton cargo vessels every day.
America is determined to build enough ships fast enough.
And those living near the shipyards knew as well as anyone that there was a war on.
Work never stopped on the ships. Early or late, it was possible to hear the roar of construction 5 miles from the shipyard.
American industrial output was said to be a tank every 5 minutes, an aircraft every half hour, and an aircraft carrier every week. But the threat to America was not on her Pacific, but on her Atlantic seaboard. In January 1942, German U-boats sank 132 ships between New York and Miami. The Germans called it Operation Drumbeat, Paukenschlag, nicknamed the Second Happy Time. The first happy time had initiated the war's longest battle, the Battle of the Atlantic. In March 1941, the First Lord of the Admiralty said,
We must impress upon both employers and workers that in facing the Battle of the Atlantic, now opening upon us, we need every ounce of their energy and ever-increasing production.
Britain's natural defense as an island may have saved her from invasion, but it was also a liability. The strength of her navy, the size of her merchant marine, almost 1/3 of the world's merchant tonnage was British, and the bounty of her empire, 42% of imports came on long voyages from imperial ports, had made Britain dependent on imports. Not for comfort, but for survival. Winston Churchill admitted,
The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. Invasion, I thought, even before the air battle, would fail. But now, our lifeline, even across the broad oceans, and especially in the entrances to the island, was endangered.
Admiral Karl Dönitz commanded the U-boats, but not in the numbers he thought necessary. It was 1942 before Hitler conceded that
the submarine will in the end decide the outcome of the war.
The fall of France brought the German U-boat fleet closer to the Atlantic shipping lanes through possession of French ports. From July 1940 to the end of October, 282 Allied ships were sunk, a loss of 1,489,795 tons of merchant shipping. When a ship was hit, getting the lifeboats away was an epic endeavor, recalled with emotion by those who witnessed it.
The wind shrieked through the rigging and superstructure. I caught a glimpse of one of the big merchant ships being rolled on its beam ends by the huge swells.
The boat was lowered somehow, and we scrambled down towards it. "Cast off!" bawled someone when the boat seemed crowded, but answered at once by yells and screams above us. "No, no, wait a second!"
We owe a debt that can never be paid to the merchant navy. We believe the vast majority of the people of this country realize what they owe to our seamen.
The Battle of the Atlantic would claim about 100,000 lives, shared almost equally between those serving in Allied navies, merchant sailors, and the U-boat crews. Tactics and weapons evolved as the battle continued. For the Allies, the most important innovation was the convoy system, but it had its limitations.
A convoy system reduces the efficiency of shipping because you have to wait for enough ships to be assembled. They move from point A to point B at the speed of the slowest. Nevertheless, by bringing the ships together, it forced the U-boats to face the defenders in order to get at the targets.
The Germans have tried hard to beat the convoy system, but they have failed. As in the last war, so in this, the convoy system has proved its efficiency.
Tactics improved, but according to a U-boat captain, nothing improved life aboard the U-boats.
All are living under constant tension produced by living in a steel tube. A small, cramped space, monotony, bad air.
Until quite late in the war, U-boats were not true submarines, capable of extended underwater operation. They had to surface often and for lengthy periods. And when they did, they were visible and vulnerable. The Kriegsmarine lost 696 out of the 830 U-boats sent out on operations, and over 70% of all U-boat crews operational between 1939 and 1945. A far greater proportion of active personnel lost than any other service of any combatant nation. According to Dönitz, the loss of a single boat was a price paid for sinking 100,000 tons of Allied shipping. But by May 1943, the value of one boat had become an unacceptably meager 10,000 tons. On May 24th, Dönitz was forced to admit that, for the moment, the battle was lost. The battle would be renewed with improved vessels and weapons, but the initiative was never regained.
The Battle of the Atlantic was the vital logistic battle of the war. Whether it failed or succeeded on either side really determined the course of the war. The turn of the tide was the result of the continuing evolution of the intelligence system. It was the result of the increase in strength of the escort forces. It was the result of technological developments, in particular direction-finding systems, by enabling the North American industrial machine to provide all the resources that were needed to fight what was an industrial war. The Battle of the Atlantic was central.
The home front understood the hardships being endured by those who went to sea. As one rescued sailor discovered,
the journey across London via the Underground, clad in a salt-stained uniform and clutching my orange-coloured life jacket, was more of an ordeal than the whole of the Western Ocean, with masses of people all wanting to crowd around me to slap my back or shake my hand.
the Battle of the Atlantic disrupted supplies to and affected lives on the home front.
Every day before the war, 10 to 15 ships were arriving in British ports bringing food, and that number halved once the war started. Churchill talks about winning the Battle of the Atlantic was the key to winning the war, and in many ways he was right. But it wasn't the key to Britain's ability to feed itself.
In 1938, 68 million tons of imports were landed in Britain. In 1941, the figure was 26 million. Golf courses were ploughed and planted. Rationing enforced. Ersatz recipes officially distributed. The shipping crisis of 1942 forced legislation in Britain outlawing white bread and introducing a detested beige bread known as the national loaf. Onions were so valued, they were given as prizes in raffles and presents on birthdays. But overall, though the diet of the middle class deteriorated during the war, that of the working class improved.
So the Battle of the Atlantic was crucial, but it never threatened Britain's survival.
But not in occupied Europe, where millions were being starved. On January 30th, 1942, the 9th anniversary of his appointment as Chancellor, Hitler spoke from the stage of the Berlin Sportspalast.
The war will not end as the Jews imagine it will, namely with the uprooting of the Aryans. But the result of this war will be the complete annihilation of the Jews.
Those walled up in ghettos were already fulfilling his prophecy. Moishe Fishman was one of them.
We finished up living 10 to a room. We slept in shifts. Because of the hygienic condition, typhus set in. We had no medicine. Whatever we had to be smuggled. If they found you outside the ghetto without the band, you were a dead person. People were dying right, left, and center. Next were ration cards. You were a German, you received 2,180, I think to be correct, calories, Navian calories, per day. If you were a Pole, you received 600. If you were Jewish, you received 300. Out of the 300, maybe 180 were edible. The rest you could throw away.
It keeps you just alive, but only just, and eventually you starve to death. Anybody who they considered to be not worthy of life, they employed this strategy of starving them to death.
The Battle of the Atlantic did not mean starvation. It meant shortages and shoddy substitutes. Elsewhere, the disruption of maritime supply lines did mean life or death. If the United Kingdom is an island nation, Japan is a nation of islands.
The Japanese go into the Second World War with America on a very frugal ration already, and it gets worse. So Japan depends on imports from abroad, but it also depends on shipping between the islands. And the American U-boat campaign against Japan is extremely effective.
1 month after Pearl Harbor, on January 7th, 1942, the USS Pollock sunk a Japanese freighter off Tokyo. It was the first of the 1,113 merchant ships sunk by the American submarines. Japan knew it could not win a war of attrition. Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, famously told his Prime Minister,
"In the first 6 to 12 months of a war with the United States and Great Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory." But if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success.
Within the space of 5 months, Japan created a vast empire. But against fragile opposition. The war against Hitler had weakened an already inadequate defense, resting in the hands of leaders who seem almost to have been designed as caricatures. Boundlessly incompetent, stubbornly racist.
A lot of racial prejudice underlies the Allies' initial reading of what the Japanese military is capable of. And so it underestimates its ability to maneuver. It underestimates simply its ability to fight. Thus, the Japanese are able to wrest control in areas that they're fighting very quickly.
Even in defeat, praise was grudging and tainted. General Archibald Wavell, overall commander-in-chief, called the force that destroyed his command
an army of highly trained gangsters.
Japanese racism was at least as toxic as that of any other country. Of those the invasion set out to conquer, the manual advised soldiers,
"We may wish to make men of them quickly, but we should not expect too much."
Racism was one of the most important explanations for the fact that the Japanese never really were able to work as closely with the Germans as they might have done.
Malaya produced 38% of the world's rubber and almost 60% of its tin. That it was a Japanese target surprised no one. Yet the defenders managed to be surprised. Almost as soon as the fight on the Malay Peninsula started, a Japanese officer concluded,
"The only thing we had to fear were the quantity of munitions and thoroughness of demolitions."
The British forces are seeking to defend the road and rail corridor by fighting on the road and rail corridor. Because if you're a military force and you want to move quickly, that's what you've got to use. They build defensive positions backed up by artillery. What they want to do is stop the Japanese in their tracks, employ the artillery, destroy them.
The British were still seeing everything in terms of roads, and so they were defending roads. The Japanese brilliantly exploited outflanking movements again and again. They found the British had established a blocking position on a road, and they just went round the back, through the jungle. And the moment the British found themselves outflanked, they retreated.
A British officer was eyewitness to the speed of Japan's advance.
Within 2 minutes, a dozen medium tanks passed me. They had crashed right through our forward companies.
General Yamashita, commanding the Japanese invasion force, had 150 tanks. They were not very good tanks, but their quality didn't matter. The British forces opposing him had no tanks.
British and Imperial forces were pretty woefully trained when it came to jungle warfare. The Indian Army, which made up a major proportion of the defenders, were trained essentially for the plains and the hills of India. This would be really useless when it came to fighting on narrow jungle tracks.
Yamashita's men had seen combat in China, but this was their first time fighting in the jungle. One Japanese colonel remarked,
The enemy retreated, leaving behind as souvenirs about 50 field guns, 50 heavy machine guns, 300 trucks.
Another colonel boasted,
"Owing to the availability of Churchill's supplies, there was no necessity for us to transport even one bag of rice."
Churchill's supplies was the name the Japanese facetiously attached to abandoned Allied supply dumps.
They were told to get Churchill's rations to raid the British soldiers' food dumps and so on. That was always a part of the strategy.
The Japanese soldier was better motivated, better trained, better prepared than his British and Australian counterpart.
Australian troops who fought on the peninsula upheld a proud tradition. One battalion, at the suggestion of its colonel, went into battle singing Waltzing Matilda. Their fight was the Battle of Muar. General Yamashita said,
"The Battle of Muar was the most savage of the whole campaign. In all fairness, the survivors of the enemy forces can feel proud, because in a week-long bloody battle without any tank or air support, they held up the whole of my army."
By the time the Japanese advance reached Singapore Island, it was outnumbered by more than 2 to 1, had been marching for 55 days, and was short of ammunition. And yet, after landing, they rolled over a disorganized force. Many of the Allied troops facing the Japanese invasion were recently arrived and mainly raw recruits. On February 13th, a Japanese English-language broadcast blared over the city, declaring that there will be no Dunkirk at Singapore. Two days later, Arthur Percival wrote in his diary,
"There is no hope or help on the horizon."
There was a kind of a collective collapse in the morale and the confidence of British forces. It was really all over when the Japanese invasion force captured the city's water supply. At that point, it would have been very easy to lay the British forces under siege.
Arthur Percival surrendered his command. His appearance, his dress, his companions, and their carriage of the Union flag could hardly have been improved on by a propagandist wishing to hollow out the reputation of the British Empire. He fitted perfectly the role of scapegoat.
It was a symbol, really, of the fact that the British Empire in the Far East was rotten, it had no substance to it, and it could be taken by a people that Churchill had been apt to despise. It was a disaster and a humiliation that he found it very, very difficult to explain in Parliament.
As an 18-year-old, Lee Kuan Yew, who would be independent Singapore's first Prime Minister, watched the British trudge into their terrible captivity.
I saw them trampling along in front of my house for 3 solid days. An endless stream of bewildered men.
With astonishing, vicious force, the Japs occupy Britain's Gibraltar of the East. 123 years in the making, lost in 7 days.
There were more British and Australian troops in Malaya and later Singapore than there were Japanese. But the Japanese simply outfought them at every turn. And, of course, Japanese commanders outcommanded them.
For Singapore and for the prisoners of war, a shocking trial was beginning. It was, Churchill said,
the greatest disaster and capitulation in British history.
He wanted them to lose nobly, gallantly. And he's almost heartbroken after the collapse of Singapore. He said, we had so many men. He said they should have done better. And he was unbelievably distressed by the fact not only that the British Army in Malaya didn't show themselves to be heroes, but they didn't even show themselves to be adequate soldiers. They simply crumpled.
The Japanese view was expressed in the diary of one of its soldiers.
I greet 1942, a year of great significance, with a body and mind as clear and clean as an azure sky. In this year, more than any other, we must fulfill the path of the warrior.
That path would be a crooked one. In every occupied territory, the killing of civilians, for little reason or no reason, started at once.
The Japanese have been fighting the Chinese for a decade, and when they conquer Singapore, who do they turn on? They turn on the Chinese population of Singapore. The Sukching, the great massacre of the Chinese, is the first big tragedy of the Japanese conquest.
Operation Sukching, carried out in Singapore from February 21st to March 4th, targeted 5 categories of Chinese males between the ages of 18 and 50. The selection was often arbitrary. At Jalan Besar, one of the screening centers, men who wore glasses are said to have been selected because they were assumed to be educated.
The Japanese military were immensely powerful and had incredibly racist, denigratory attitudes towards the peoples of East Asia, over which they were gradually annexing territory.
Massacre sites included the beaches at Punggol, Changi, Katong, Tanah Merah, and Blakang Mati, now Sentosa Island. Japan admits the outrage and puts the death toll at 5,000. The Singaporean estimate is between 20,000 and 50,000 killed.
What usually happens in a campaign of violence is that you manage to bind different groups of people together around some common ideological or political program so that you can engage in violence on this scale. But there's no one motive, there's no one mindset.
Within days of completing the conquest of Malaya, Japanese forces struck towards the Dutch East Indies and its prize oil fields. There, the critical engagement was at sea, where the Battle of the Java Sea destroyed an Allied fleet, sailing under the Dutch Admiral Karel Doorman. 10 ships and 2,000 men, including Doorman, were sent to the bottom for the loss of one Japanese troop transport. The invaders landed. The fight on land lasted a week. Two months earlier, just 3 hours after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had attacked the British colony of Hong Kong. Following a week of aerial bombardment, Japanese envoys crossed Hong Kong Harbor under safe passage with a message for the British governor. Sir Mark Young sent them back with his response.
The governor and commander-in-chief of Hong Kong declines absolutely to enter into negotiations for the surrender of Hong Kong.
It was noble, but it was costly. The following day, under cover of a heavy artillery barrage, Japanese troops landed on Hong Kong Island. In preparing the invasion of Hong Kong, the Japanese commander of the first wave, Colonel Tanaka, told his regiment they were to take no prisoners. They obeyed his order. The colony surrendered in the afternoon, but the atrocities continued. America's presence in the Philippines, it was never called a colony, went back to the 1898 war with Spain. General Douglas MacArthur's father had been its military governor, which is why MacArthur was invited to organize its army. He claimed he had a
tremendously strong offensive and defensive force.
He had 130,000 men in uniform. But 100,000 were Filipinos who were to fight with great courage. But they had been trained in close order drill. They could salute, but not much else.
The Philippines, of course, they knew something was coming, but it was a long time since they'd been at war, and they weren't fully combat-minded until the combat happened.
7.5 hours after Pearl Harbor, the first attack hit Luzon, the largest island in the Philippines. Destroying on the ground 86 of the 160 American aircraft on the island. The main landing on Luzon established 43,110 men of the Japanese 14th Army ashore. MacArthur reported,
"My gallant divisions are holding ground and denying the foe the sacred soil of the Philippines."
It wasn't true. A second landing threatened Manila, which was declared an open city, but the convention was not observed. Filipinos who failed to bow 3 times to Japanese soldiers were hanged in public places. MacArthur left Manila for Corregidor. On January 1st, Allied forces completed their withdrawal to Bataan. On the 22nd, MacArthur ordered withdrawal to the final defensive line, and on the 24th, cabled Washington.
"I intend to fight it out to complete destruction."
But Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to transfer his headquarters to Australia, and on March 11th, he was evacuated by submarine. A poem written in a Japanese POW camp gave voice to the thoughts of some, perhaps not all, of those he commanded. The 9th, Major General King, asking his opposite number,
Let him go, let him go. We are the braver. Stain his hands with our blood, dye them forever. Recall, O ye kinsmen, how he left us to die, starved and insulted by his infamous lie.
Following a bombing campaign, the final Japanese offensive on Bataan opened on April 3rd. Allied forces surrendered on the 9th. General Major King, asking his opposite number,
Will our troops be well treated?
"We are not barbarians."
They were. The 78,000 taken prisoner were to be marched more than 100 kilometers into captivity under the scorching sun, with hardly any food or water. This was the Bataan Death March. Filipino deaths on the march are estimated as high as 18,000. More than 600 of the 12,000 Americans on the death march died. Barely a third of those who survived were alive at the end of the war. 3.5% of the Allied prisoners of Germany died in captivity. The toll for Allied prisoners of the Japanese was almost 10 times that figure. In America, civilians of Japanese heritage were victims of discrimination and unfair treatment. President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066, aimed, it said, at preventing espionage on American shores, authorized the evacuation of all persons considered a threat from the West Coast to internment camps further inland. The order did not specify any ethnic group, but curfews were announced that applied only to Japanese Americans. Then, on March 29, 1942, under the authority of the executive order, Lieutenant General John L.W. DeWitt issued Public Proclamation No. 4, which began the forced evacuation and detention of West Coast residents of Japanese American ancestry. Those interned were given 48 hours' notice. Unless they were able to dispose of or make arrangements for their property within that time, their homes, businesses, and private belongings were lost forever. Between March and August, around 112,000 people, nearly 70,000 of them born in America, were sent to Army-style barracks. None faced charges of disloyalty, and there was no means by which they could appeal their loss of property and personal liberty. 10 different internment camps were established many miles inland, mostly in desolate locales. In the camps, families with the clothing and possessions they could carry with them lived until the end of the war. But that was 3 years away. On May 5th, just 10 weeks after Roosevelt signed Order 9066, Japanese forces landed on Corregidor after a bombardment of 16,000 shells. On the 6th, General Wainwright sent a cable.
With profound regret and continued pride in my gallant troops, I go to meet the Japanese commander. Goodbye, Mr. President.
He then surrendered his garrison on Mindanao. On the 16th, General William Sharp surrendered the last of the Allied forces and brought the Philippines campaign to an end. Germany had launched its assault on the Soviet Union. At the end of the year, Japan swept across East Asia and the Pacific. In the early months of 1942, the Allies confronted two vast empires that had been created with unimaginable speed. And then, less than 3 weeks after General Sharp's surrender, the US Pacific and Imperial Japanese fleets met at Midway. By the end of 1942, in North Africa, in Russia, in the Pacific, the whole direction of the war had been reversed.